I'm in the container host that I just started, and I have started a command line as an administrator. So this is a command line running as an administrator inside the container host. If you type host name, you can find the EC2 instance host name. So this is not the container ID. This is the instance name of the EC2 instance that I'm using for lab purpose. To run a Docker container, I type docker run and I type -it to run it interactively, so that when the container starts, I get a place to type some commands. So I want to go inside the container and then inspect it. So that's why I'm typing IT to run the container in an interactive mode. And the image that I want to run is Microsoft Windows Server Core image, the famous image that we have been playing around. And when I run this, I want to run PowerShell inside this container. So the PowerShell will start inside that container. When I type enter, because I run it interactively, I will go inside the container. As you can find that the container started very quickly. The container starts very quickly because it doesn't need to go through a very complex boot process like a virtual machine. So now I'm inside the container running PowerShell. You can find that the PS is in front of the C-//. And if you type host name, what you get is the container ID. Sorry, I made a mistake here. So you need to type host name. What you will get is the container ID. So this is an isolated environment. Its file system is isolated from the container host or any other running containers. Its process list or memory structure is completely isolated from rest of the running containers or container host. If I type dir, you can find the file system inside the container. So this is completely different from the file system that you will find in the container host. To give you an idea, so this is the file system of the container host. And if you go to the C drive, you can find that some of the folders in the C drive of the container host are not visible in the container. So this is how the container gets the proper isolation. If I create a directory inside the container called sample data, you can find that sample data folder is created, but you won't find that one in the container host. So all the DLLs, the registries, any configuration that you applied into the container are not applied to the container host. They are completely two different isolated environments. So let me start another container. In this case, I'm again going to run this container interactively. So I'm going to run docker run IT Microsoft Windows Server Core image, and I'm going to run PowerShell and start the second container. So I have started the second container. So you can run multiple containers in the container host. If I type host name, you will find that it got a different container ID than the first container that I created. So if I type the host name in the first container, you can find its container ID is something like 5C00, whereas in the container 2, its ID is 5AZ. If you type dir in the second container, you will find that the first folder that I created in the container 1 is not available in the container 2. So the container 1 and container 2 file systems are completely isolated. Any program that you install in container 1 is not visible to container 2, or any program that you install in the container 2 is not visible in the container 1. It's not only the file systems that are completely isolated, the process structure is also isolated. To give you an idea, so if I type task list, it will give you the list of processes running inside the container 1. You can find that some of these container IDs, if you inspect carefully, are not available in container 2. So if I type task list in container 2, you can find that the process IDs that the container 2 running are not the same IDs that the container 1 is running, except few exceptional cases like the system and idle process. Just ignore them for the moment. So let's start another process, let's say command line inside this container, to see that these newly started processes, are they visible in the second container. So I started the command line inside the container 1, and if I type task list, you will find that command line that I just started. So its process ID is 7952. If you type task list in second container, you will find that the newly started container in the container 1 is not visible in container 2. So the container 1 is completely isolated from container 2. So if I start, let's say, a command line in the container 2 and then type task list, you will find that the container ID, the process ID I got was 5132, and it's completely different from the process ID that I got in the container 1 for the command line. So that's how you get the process level isolation. So although these isolations happens between containers, so container 1 processes are not visible in container 2 and container 2 processes are not visible in container 1, these processes are visible to the container host. So if I bring the task list inside the container host, and if you go into the details, you will find these processes, let's say the command line that I started in container 1 and container 2 are visible inside the container host. For example, the command line process ID for container 1 is 7952. So you can find that 7952 is available or visible inside the container host. I can of course go there and then terminate this task or the process. So before that, observe what happens next to this C:// entry. From the time that I click end task, you will find that process will terminate. So let me terminate this process from the container host. So you can find that immediately when I click the end task, the command line returned because the process got killed. So if I type task list again, you will find that process with 7952 is not available because I terminated it from the container host. Same for the container 2. I have this command running in process ID 5132. So let me find from the container host that process. 5132 is the process ID. Let me find it here. So there you are. So if I terminate this process from the container host, like before, the command will terminate. So let me end this process. And the command line that I was running inside the container 2 terminated. So if you type task list, 5132 process is no longer available. So what you realize is that container 1 processes are isolated from container 2 and container 2 processes are isolated from container 1, but they are visible inside the container host. Let me do a bit of cleanup here before we go to the next lesson. So what we are going to learn next is how to get the list of containers running. So let me clean up here, do a clear screen, and this screen also, let's clear this up. And I'm going to start another command line which I run in the container host. So there are two containers, container 1 and container 2, and in another command line that is running on container host. To get the list of containers running, you can type docker ps in the container host. So that gives you the two containers that is running. You can find there's one container, container 1 with the ID 5C00, and container 2, the container ID is 5AC. So if you type docker ps, you get the list of containers running in the container host. You can find that the container 1 is running PowerShell, and when you type docker ps, you get the list of containers running along with the command that the container is running. So in this case, it's running PowerShell. So there are multiple ways to exit from a container. You can type exit. What will happen is the PowerShell that was running inside the container will terminate because there's no any processor running now for that container. That container has exited. So you can find there's only one container running, which is the container 2, because we exit the process that was running in the container 1. So that's the one way to exit from the container. But what if you want to exit from the container without terminating the process? How can you do that? The way to do that is to type Control PQ. So you need to type the control button and then type PQ, and it will return to the container host. If you type docker ps to get the list of containers running, you will find that the container 2, which is 5AC, is still running behind the scene as a background task. So if you want to or return to the container host without terminating the process, you need to type control button plus PQ. There's another way to attach into that running container. So you can type docker attach 5AC to go back into the container that is running and then get the interactive mode. So in this case, I'm going to attach into the running container, the second container 5AC. And when I type enter, I will go back to the interactive mode that I had before. So I will enter into the container 2. If you type, for example, dir, you will get the file system of the container 2. You will find that the container file system remains as it is. So to give an idea, let's make a directory called sample data, let's say 2. And so this sample data 2 is in the container 2. Let me type control button and then type PQ to return to the container host. And if I type docker ps, you will find that the container is still running, and the host name is the container host. So this command is at the moment is running in the container host. So let me go back into the container again and then attach into that. So when I type docker attach and the container ID, I attach into that container 2. And if I type dir, you can find that the folder that I just created is still available in that container. So the container didn't stop. If you type host name, you will get the same container host ID or the container ID that we got for the container 2 before. So let me type control PQ and then return to the container host. If I go to, so right now all the consoles are in container host. I'm not attached to any of the containers. So let's clear the screen. And if I type docker ps, you will find the running container 5AC8B. So this is the container 2 that started a moment ago. So it's running. To get all the containers, including the one that has exited, you need to type docker ps-a to get all the containers. You can find that I exited from container 1 with 5C00 about 3 minutes ago, and container 2 is still running for about 11 minutes. If I type docker ps, it gives only the running containers, which is in this case the container 2. To stop a container, I can type dockerstop and then give the container ID. So in this case, the second container ID is 5AC. If I enter, it will stop the container. And if I type docker ps, you can now find there's no running containers. If I type docker ps-a, you will get all the list of containers. But because I stopped the second container, you can find now the state of all the containers are in exited state. So of course, in the same way that I stop a container, I can of course start a container. If I type docker ps, you will get the list of containers. And if I type docker ps-a, you get all the containers. So the container ID of the first container is 5c00. So I'm going to start that container. To start the container, you type docker start and give the container ID that I want to start. So in this case, the one that I stop, the first container is 5c00. And when I enter, it will start the container. Of course, it's not going to go inside the container because it's going to start the container in the background. So that container is running in the background. If you want to attach into that and go into the interactive mode, of course, you can do with docker attach. So all you need to do is to type docker attach and then type the ID of that running container. So in this case, it's 5z00. You don't need to give the full docker IDs. You can give only a partial docker ID as long as it's distinguished, that's fine. So if I type if I type dir inside the container one, you can find that the previous folder that I created, sample data, is available. So if I type docker ps -a, you can find that the second container is still under stop state. So let's start that. I just give enough container ID to distinguish it from the rest of the containers. You don't need to provide the full docker ID. So it started the container behind the scene, and I'm going to attach into that so that I can type some commands inside that container. So I type docker attach 5ac, and then I go inside the container. And if I type dir, you will get the sample data2 directory that I created. When you stop a container, you are not going to lose the data inside that container. It's going to remain in the running layer of the container. So if I type docker ps -a, you will get all the containers, and you can find they are in the state of up state. So they are not in exited state. So obviously I can again type docker stop and then give a container ID to stop the container. And you can type docker stop for the second container, which is I guess 5z00, and it terminated. It exited from the running state. Let me type docker ps-a to get the status of all the containers. You can find that there are 2 containers in exited state. The obvious question is how we can permanently remove these containers. I don't want them to hanging around in my container host. So to do that, you type docker rm to remove and then give the container ID. So I remove the container that starts with the container ID 5ac, and let me remove the container that starts with 5c0. So if you type docker ps-a, you'll find that there's no any containers. So by using docker rm, you can remove a container completely. So far we ran containers in interactive mode. What if you want to run a container in the background and in the detach mode? To do that, you type docker run -d to run it in detach mode. And like before, you give the container image name, Microsoft Windows Server Core, and I'm going to run PowerShell. What happened is it returned immediately to the container host. And if you type host name, you are in the container host. You can find that it gives the container host name. And if you type docker ps, you'll find that there's no container running. So what happened to the PowerShell that I just started? What happened was the Docker started the Windows Server Core image, ran PowerShell inside that. Because there's nothing to run and it is running in the detach mode, it exited immediately. So you can find the exited container. So it started PowerShell, there's nothing to run, and it exited. So instead of running this PowerShell in detach mode, which will have nothing to run, so I'm going to run a continuous ping. So to do that, I'm going to run docker run detach mode -d Microsoft Windows Server Core image, but in this time I'm going to do a continuous ping to the famous Google IP address 8.8.8.8, and I'm going to run it continuously. So this will do a continuous ping to this IP address. So if I type host name, you can find that it immediately returns into the container host. So I'm running in detach mode. If I type docker ps, now the container is running because it has some process to run, which in this case a continuous ping. The challenge you will find here is that when you run in the detached mode, some process like ping, continuous ping, how can you attach into that? So if I run this process and press enter, it will return into the container host. So it gives the container ID. So if you type docker ps, it gives that A4B as the container ID. If I try to attach into this container with ID A4B by typing docker attach A4B, you will get attached into the console that the continuous ping is running. So the question is, how can I type something here? Of course, you can't. So the question is, how can we execute a command in a container that is always running? So maybe you want to execute a command to create a directory. So here you don't have the option to type that command. The way to do that is using a command called dockerexit. So I started this command line window. So let's do a bit of cleanup. And right now there is this Docker container running. So if you terminate that console, it didn't stop the container because the ping is still running. So what I'm going to do now is to execute a command inside this container. So to do that, you can type dockerexit, and I'm going to run it in the detached mode. So I'm going to type -d, and you need to give the target container. So the target container here is 4AB. That's where I want to run this command. And I'm going to run command line, and the command for the command line is to make directory mkdir. And I'm going to give a directory name called hello world. What will happen is the Docker is going to execute this command inside that running container. So even though the ping is running, ping will not stop, and it's going to execute another command which will create this directory. To see that, let me execute dockerexit. So in this case, I'm going to execute dockerexit in interactive mode. For the same target container, I'm going to run command line. So previously when we attach, you got into the running process, which is ping. But in this case, I execute command line, and you can find the ping is still running. But I'm running this command line that I just started with dockerexit. And the hello world directory that I created with dockerexit is in my file system. So if I exit, what's going to exit is only the command line that I started with exit. The container is still running with the continuous ping. If I type dockerexit in detached mode, let's say this time we are going to target the same container 4AB, and I'm going to run command, and then I'm going to run remove directory hello world to remove that directory. If I type enter, it will return to the console immediately. And if I type dockerexit interactively and then go into the container, run PowerShell inside that, you will find that I go inside the container. This time it started the PowerShell. If I type dir, the directory is gone because I removed that directory. If I type task list, this time it started PowerShell and the ping is still running. So this is something that you can use to, for example, execute some commands. Imagine that you have a container that is running IIS and you want to create a directory, execute some commands. You can still do that with dockerexit. If you want to run it interactively, you can type IT. If you want to run it detached mode, you can type -d